Plastick Nature, a philosophical poem by Terence Craig. Canto V. Satiric writers like La Bruyere had long condemned the court's duplicities. The fawning courtier, who had but one care, to seem the friend of all and all to please, became a devil of falsehood. At his ease he feigned tears like an actor on the stage. With Diderot, these criticisms cease. He thought an actor must feign tears and rage, without him feeling these, but just to earn a wage. So if the courtier is a skilful actor, the actor's somewhat like a courtier too, a puppet on a string, with the added factor that he's the puppet master hid from view. He feigns emotions which are quite untrue. He is a master of cold calculation. The courtiers of the self-same monstrous crew. No wonder that in time the shocked French nation rose up and cast both king and courtiers from their station. The structure of the kingdom was disjointed, and as befell in England once before, the people rose against the Lord's anointed, and angered at his courtiers all the more, struck off the heads and wallowed in the gore. Even the king's head fell. 'Twas wan and mute. No longer could it speak like kings of yore, words of command that each occasion suit. Now there's a swell of talk that will reign absolute. The son of microcosm the heart's dethroned. He is stripped of all prerogatives and power. He lacks the vassals that him loyally owned, nor holds court with the organs every hour. Up in the head, like in a castle tower, a theatre of voices plays somehow. States General have occupied this bower to make laws that the people will avow, and no king having summoned can dismiss them now. Romantics were still interested in will. How it unthinkingly was always seeking the stimulus of automatic skill to make a start and energy get peaking. Kleist found that our ideas come with speaking, and took as his example Mirabeau, who as the Estates General were eking their time out, heard the king's command to go, and finding his ideas, found his voice also. For long the assembly had deliberated, discussing with no small politic art, and when the king alarmed, it abrogated. The deputies were loath now to depart. So when a royal official took his part, and asked, had they not heard Louis's command? 'Twas Mirabeau who told him from his heart the nation's representatives would stand, and save by force would not be from the assembly banned. Again, Kleist thought that unreflecting action is better than acts carefully prepared. Once you've responded to your satisfaction, you can improve, refine the act you dared to carry out. No thoughts can be compared with the energy that spurs you to engage. A wrestler with a stout opponent paired must all unthinking his responses gauge. Our life's a fight with fate, no time to play the sage. Yet Kleist could see the conflict twixt man's will and unreflecting movement so divine. Unthinking man makes no mistakes, and still his conscious mind is not in judgment fine. A dancer may be skilled, but must resign the prize to the all-unthinking marionette, which moves its string-pulled limbs in a straight line and puts its feet wherever they are set, unlike the man who acts but stays in reason's debt. That is why the unthinking marionette, more graceful than a human dancer, dances. The human dancer has his thinking set on his performance and the circumstances, and what technique his artistry advances, and so he cannot fly on nature's wings. It's lack of mind that puppets' moves enhances, save that a puppet master pulls the strings, projects his own expression into lifeless things. Kleist tells the story of the captive bear, which skilful swordsmen's every thrust could parry. Not only that, but he would have no care just to repel a feint, unnecessary, because he knew the swordsmen would not tarry to make the seeming thrust and follow through. Thus vigilance with no thought he did marry, responding only when he needed to, for what was thrust and what was feint he always knew. Kleist also tells us of a charming youth, who after they had both come from a swim, himself glimpsed in a mirror, and in truth he seemed the boy a thorn stuck in a limb in that famed sculpture. But Kleist, on a whim, to puncture his young vanity, just laughed. This had a terrible effect on him. He could no longer pose, having been chaffed, and afterwards he lost of grace the once instinctive craft. First gazing in a mirror, we are aware that we exist, an independent being, but also we can see that we are there, an object that's exposed to others' seeing. We may admire ourselves, others agreeing, the subject matches the object thereof, but if they laugh, we'll surely feel like fleeing. Narcissus with his image falls in love, but only he is looking in the water from above. When Eve and Adam ate forbidden fruit, says Kleist, they suddenly were self-aware, and rising far above the unthinking brute, began of others' gaze to have a care. Since then of paradise we have no share, but if we travelled all the world around, perhaps we might find a back door somewhere, and eat an apple on that blessed ground, that we from consciousness might be again unbound. Man's great achievement is to think and know, but he cannot perfect activity unless, consenting to let reason go, he sets the natural powers within him free. Not by his conscious effort can he be perfected. Here all struggle is but vain. He must be puppet or divinity. Some say this conflict caused Kleist so much pain that he despaired and put a bullet in his brain. Already Schiller named two kinds of poet: the naive, who remained in touch with nature, spontaneously composing, did he know it? And then the sentimental, whose main feature was intellect and of thought the portraiture. Naive meant Homer, Ossian, the antique. The sentimental poet was a creature who always would reflect before he'd speak. The naive trusted to his instincts like a Greek. But Schiller wrote upon another theme, of more importance still for us to trace: the qualities of movement which do seem to add to beauty, qualities called grace, that are not like the beauty of a face, the gift of nature, but instead achieved by man himself. This is the very place of harmony, if Schiller is believed, between the body and the will that's undeceived, enjoying perfect freedom in its actions, the voluntary movements of the man. He also thought that grace, one of the attractions we share with animals, which also can move gracefully without a will or plan, requires the counterweight of dignity to keep unwilling movements in the span of will's control. Thus Schiller, now we see, mistook for will the grace that is involuntary. Though only voluntary acts are free, and therefore suitable to embody grace, there are involuntary, he could see, which can contribute to a charming pace of action willed. The play of eyes and face, the gesturing hand and the melodious tone, accompanying speech, are of this a clear case. These are due to emotion, and 'tis known that such signs may be feigned by the actor's skill alone. Yet he was right to focus thought on grace. For Aphrodite, he says, wore a zone which made all men wish only her embrace. Its power was not confined to her alone, for she to others could this girdle loan. It made them irresistible to all, by which, says Schiller, this great truth's made known, that beauty's gift to one alone may fall, but grace can light on any, and all men enthrall. Now Schiller thought of grace in terms political. Grace in a king is liberality. He rules, and without being hypocritical, he lets the people think to a degree decisions are their own, their actions free. This is, in a collective institution, the naturalness of will in harmony. For if the king's power suffers diminution, the mob goes wild, like Paris in the Revolution. The moral is that grace is just the thing that builds the beauty into human motion. Yet grace, which forms the gestures of a king, or of a dancer expressing emotion, is fine, but is just an aesthetic notion. It's not the only thing in automatic behaviour that requires our strict devotion. There's also skill, which never is erratic, while grace only comes in where movement's acrobatic. Man, as Kleist saw, is skilful to the extent that he yields the control of conscious will to water that from nature's well is lent to him, and into reason's world does spill. The grace his every movement that can fill comes not from moral excellence at all, or human freedom used for good or ill, but from the silencing of reason's call, that else commands the city's gate, defends the wall. Musicians had, on thinking, felt at home in keeping time to music as they played. Then came a clockwork thing, the metronome, which could to follow any beat be made. Beethoven, being deaf, welcomed this aid, but he and others who had first been keen were by its regularity dismayed. For keeping time the same thing did not mean as rhythm, which is supple and is no machine. Romantics valued being close to nature, and the spontaneous versus the contrived. Feeling, not thinking, was the important feature of poetry, which, if truthful, a record of what of feeling has survived, not from the mind, but from the feeling heart, like Shelley's, by the singing lark revived, which showed the inspired poet's song to start in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Novalis thought language a thing at play. We grasp it not, it speaks but its own truth, and when we try to force it to our way to express ideas, they come forth uncouth. Whereas if we talk empty words, forsooth, our language brings forth utterance profound. If only we could be like carefree youth, and speak all unreflecting, it would sound as if some poet or prophet endless truth had found. For Humboldt, language was a chain of iron that kept the speaker bounded to his nation. His native tongue, which aye did him environ, constrained his speaking and his cogitation. While tongues are always changing their formation, no speaker can them change, for good or ill. Language, thought Humboldt, has a deep foundation, and wells up from a source beyond man's will, yet in the expression of his thought, man is free still. Philosophers on habit were emphatic. Habit they saw as being a middle point between the voluntary and automatic, since it is like the movement of a joint, which yet will or desire must needs anoint. Habit involves a fading vividness, which thing men de Biran did disappoint. While action thus perfection could access, the role of conscious thought in it was all the less. A revolutionary, men had found that habit is an obstacle to change, that in the state or laws may have its ground. Tradition, habit, thus can man estrange from revolution when it would arrange the state a different way. For Homo Faber has learned his trade within a definite range where he would stay. The new division of labour will make the drudge less flexible than his rich neighbour. But Ravissant saw habit as arising from what he viewed as spontaneity, which all unplanned activity comprising, goes beyond conscious will, it is so free. What could this spontaneity then be? He saw it as the pulse of life within, a force that man can neither name nor see, a force to the divine perhaps akin, where every glorious action of man must begin. Hegel considered habit second nature, as Ravison had done. It let the mind emancipate itself from body's creature. His drives and passions else had man defined, but habit trained man to be more refined, and to subject himself to conscious will. To have oneself is the origin behind the notion habit, inner strength that still is cultivated by the exercise of skill. For Hegel found the master rules the servant, but then the servant makes the master king of his own mind and body, and is fervent in making himself to commandments cling, from that voice of control in everything. This gives him a direction that is more than the mere life of drives in him could bring. He thus of habits gains a varied store, which makes him more self-ruling than he was before. He thought political decision-making had once come from the people being possessed by an outside will, authority partaking, so that they went to work at the behest of kings who with their voice their will impressed upon men's minds. The voice of truth might speak through oracles whose meaning must be guessed. The oracle might be heard by one man meek, as happened now with Socrates, that saintly Greek, who heard a voice that told him right and wrong, an inner voice which he, the daemon, hight, although he argued, mingled with the throng, and talked with men of what was good and right. In questions Socrates took much delight, which stimulated citizens to bring their own thoughts forth, and thus he might free them from voice of oracle or king, to hear the voice of reason, and to it to cling. Language and habit point to memory. These powers do more than ever willpower can, and yet they strengthen will, set reason free. To use our skills we need a memory span, but memory too enslaves, invokes some plan we've always known, and thus prevents the new. So it must be, for man would not be man, without a memory that gives him its clue. He cannot go down every path, nor every thought pursue. A medical account of this was wanting, which could show memory working in the brain. The brain an unknown world, the task was daunting, till Gall, with talk and scalpel, made it plain that memory, and language in its train, were functions localized in different parts of our brain substance, though he tried in vain to forecast from men's skulls their gift of arts. Phrenology was right, and brain science from it starts. Gall was confused by physiognomy, the age-old study of the human face. We cannot understand phrenology unless we give the old study its true place as an attempt to explain the human race, that saw the characters of men expressed in passions over time that left a trace upon the facial lineaments impressed, from which the sage might read what's hidden in the breast. Gall was a well-known Viennese physician. Better anatomist you could not find. He took a strong materialist position, that brain was the sole basis of man's mind. A view like this, which clearly undermined the soul, the Habsburg Kaiser could not bear, and so forbade his lectures. Not confined, Gall lectured all through Germany, did dare to seek more fame, and so to Paris did repair. Inspired by Lavater, but a physician, Gall saw himself as playing the sage's part, interpreting men's inner disposition according to a sort of cranial chart of bumps on skulls. But just as there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face, Gall was deceived in trying to impart a meaning to the cranium's bony space, depending on what part of brain was lying at the base. Whether in Vienna, in Paris, or on tour, Gall moved well in societies of men. But even with his reputation sure, it had a darker side, and all heard then he kept a strange museum in his den, with many an acquaintance's dead head, so that Gall could recall his traits again. Vienna's royal librarian had said that Gall was not to get his skull when he was dead. It made men's minds uneasy to reflect that mind might be reduced to bodily matter, the anatomist being able to dissect the brain and find the faculties they flatter themselves to be immortal. He could shatter illusions that most of mankind can lull. The unity of mind he seemed to scatter throughout the bulging brain inside the skull, in parts that made man capable, intelligent, or dull. Intriguing these perspectives were to many that Gall was opening to investigation, for Goethe was as much convinced as any, looking at Schiller's skull in admiration, that he could see the marks of genius' station, and read them like the letters in a text. So, even faced with mortal limitation, he could feel warmed, exalted, not perplexed, to read the life of man, whatever might come next. For others, like Fleurance, Gall was creating a science no more substantial than a mist, peopling the brain, the matter complicating, with mental organs which did not exist. For if one were with scalpel to persist, he would not find these things inside the brain. As doomed Napoleon, though he did enlist the hosts of Europe, Moscow's walls to gain, found the place empty, and had captured it in vain. For staking all on one last gamble, he his mighty army of allies had led into the heart of Russia, rapidly aiming to strike a blow, cut off the head of the enemy before invasion bred resistance. Moscow's where he stuck the knife, but taking it, he found a city dead, without inhabitants or signs of life, much less a hostile army in opposing strife. The Poles above the city had rejoiced and given thanks to God that their old foe was at their mercy, but the cry they voiced died on their lips before the scene below. The enemy had vanished in the snow. No army left the city to defend, no citizens a siege to undergo. Napoleon was surprised, and in the end entered an empty palace, there the night to spend. And there that very night, as he looked out, he saw a distant quarter was aflame. The Russians had set house fires round about before they left, because their secret aim was to burn Moscow and thus to reclaim it from the invader. Word to evacuate was given, and Napoleon had the shame of galloping in haste to a postern gate to escape the conflagration, barely cheating fate. To burn down their own cities, he opines. It is the very demon who inspires these bold barbarians to such fell designs. But now he had been driven from the fires of Moscow, and Napoleon's desires were set at naught, out in the cold and snow of winter, which with the enemy conspires. He back to Paris was compelled to go, his army but a remnant, and his plans laid low. You have been listening Plastick Nature, a philosophical poem by Terence Craig. Canto V.